Hi guys, welcome to Commercial Law Tutorials, Law of Purchase and Sale. We have already looked at the definition and the essentials, duties of the buyer and those of the seller, latent and patent defects, and also passing of risk. Today we are going to move on to delivery, that is lesson number 5. In this lesson, first of all, we are going to define what delivery is. Then we'll look at the types of delivery we have. And at the end of the lesson, I'll give you popular exam questions relating to this lesson. What is delivery? Delivery is the voluntary transfer of possession from the seller to the buyer. It is the handing over of an object, money, or document to the buyer by the seller. So the seller hands over to the buyer whatever the buyer has bought from the seller. That is delivery. Let us look at the general rule. The general rule is that it is the duty of the seller to deliver the goods in accordance with the terms and conditions of the contract between the buyer and the seller. So it is the duty of the seller to deliver the goods to the buyer. That is the general rule. We have various forms of delivery. We have actual delivery, constructive delivery, registration, and Cession. Those are the forms of delivery we have. I will explain this in detail. I'll start off with actual delivery. Actual delivery is physical delivery, whereby there is physical movement of the property that has been sold by the seller to the buyer. The physical movement involves actual physical handing over of the thing by the seller to the buyer. That is from hand to hand. So we are saying that goods are physically handed over by the seller or his authorized agent to the buyer or his agent also, who has got the authority to take possession of the goods for the buyer. So the seller has the thing, he sells the thing to the buyer, and delivery is made physically to the buyer by the seller. That is actual delivery. For instance, a hand-to-hand exchange of a prescription drug in a pharmacy, that is actual delivery. Constructive delivery. Constructive delivery is fictitious delivery. There is no physical handing over of goods bought by the seller to the buyer that takes place. The mix just stays where it is at the time of legal delivery. That is constructive delivery. So, constructive delivery is usually used where actual delivery is difficult or impossible or unnecessary. That is when it is used. We have got various types of constructive delivery. We have symbolical delivery, delivery with the long hand, delivery with the short hand, Attornment, and Constitutum Possessorium. I will explain the forms of constructive delivery in detail, starting off with symbolical delivery. Symbolical delivery is the kind of delivery which involves the delivery of a thing by a seller to the buyer as a token of transfer of some other thing that has been bought by that buyer. So the seller hands over to the purchaser some other thing which is the means of control of the thing that has been bought by the buyer. The seller has the thing in this situation, sells the thing to the buyer, and delivers another thing to the buyer, which is the means of control to the property that has been bought by the buyer. This usually occurs where mix is too large for physical delivery. Seller handing over keys to the warehouse containing the sold movable property, or where the seller hands over keys to the car or house that has been bought by the buyer. The keys are the control to the mix or thing that has been bought by the buyer. The seller cannot physically hand over the car or the house using actual delivery. So he uses symbolical delivery where keys to the car or to the house are delivered to the buyer, which are the means of control to the car and that house also, respectively. Delivery with the long hand. The seller points out to the buyer the property, authorizing the buyer to deal with it. So the seller has the thing. He sells the thing to the buyer, points out the thing to the buyer, such that the buyer can deal with the property that has been pointed out to him. That is delivered with the long hand. This is because of the bulkiness of the property that has been sold. It will be inconvenient for the seller to deliver the goods physically. So the goods are just pointed out for the buyer. For instance, the pointing out of cattle by one party to another. That is the pointing out of cattle bought by the buyer, by the seller. Delivery with the short hand. This takes place when it is agreed that a person who already has the physical possession of a thing, not as the owner though, but keeping it for the seller, shall in future hold it in his own name as the new owner. So the seller sells a thing that the buyer already has, and the buyer just keeps it as before, but now not for the seller, but in his own name. That is delivered with the short hand. For instance, where goods that have been pledged are taken over by the pledgee. Next, we have attornment. Attornment is the transfer of immediate possession of a thing which is in the immediate possession of a third party. It occurs when the seller sells his property which is in the custody of another person, a third party. The person that is the third party with that property will then deliver that property to the buyer for the seller. So we are saying that the seller sells a thing to the buyer, but the thing is in the possession of a third party, who then delivers that thing for the seller to the buyer. For instance, when there is the consent of a tenant to the transfer of his relationship to his landlord to another person who has just bought that property, which is under lease, or where A sells to B his cows being kept at D's farm. A asks D to give B the cows. D assents to the order and hand over the cows as per the instruction from A. This is delivered by attornment of. Next, we have Constructum Possessorium. It is a possessory agreement. When the seller, holding the thing in his own name, sells it and thereafter still keeps possession of that same thing that he has just sold, but now holding it in the name of the buyer. That is possessory agreement. So the seller has the thing. He holds the thing for the buyer after selling that thing to the buyer. For instance, A sells his car to B and arranges that A will keep the car as a lessee. Or D buys cows from E and the two agree that the cows will stay at E's farm for milking on their mothers until weaned. Then D will take the cows back to his farm. G buys second-hand machine from F, who remains with the machine for repairs. Next, we have registration. Registration is used for immovable property. Delivery is done in the event of registration of that property that has been sold to the buyer in the new owner's name, the buyer's name, at the expected office. So as shown here, seller has the property in his name. That seller sells the property to the buyer. Delivery is done through registration. The property is registered in the buyer's name. That is when delivery is done. A few examples for you. Buildings in general, houses, church buildings, warehouses, and also land on top of all these buildings uses registration. Last, we have cession. Cession is used for intangible property. Delivery is done through the cession of that property sold. There is transferring and registration that has to be done. So as shown here, the seller has the intangible property in his name, sells that property to the buyer, and delivery is done by the registration and transferring of that property in buyer's name. A few examples for you. We have shares in a company. They use cession. Patents and trademarks, they also use cession. That was all I had for you. Let us now look at the questions we have today. Evaluate the various ways in which delivery can be made. What is constructive delivery of goods? Explain how delivery of goods can be done for both movable and immovable property. What is Constitutum Possessorium? Outline the requirements for this and why this form of transfer is applied with caution. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe. I'd like to thank those who have already subscribed. That means a lot to me. Thank you so much for your support. On top of subscribing, remember to click on the notification bell so that you can be notified each time I upload a new video. Additionally, also remember to like and comment